Okay, girls, time for a quick video.
Great. What's the video going to be about today, Master?
It's gonna be about heroin.
Heroin? That's bad. That's the brown bad. That's chasing the dragon and stuff. We've heard that's bad.
Not this heroin. This is a female hero kind of heroin.
A superhero? I like those.
Not a superhero, but a real person. And to me, a heroine. Her name, Clara Helene Immerwahr.
I've not heard of her, Master. What did she do?
You wouldn't have heard of her, but you might recognise her by her married surname, Clara Haber.
Haber. Isn't that the evil man who gassed, he just gassed everyone. He liked to gas people.
Yeah, basically he did, yeah. He was a great chemist, so... But we're not talking about him. We're talking about his wife, Clara Helene Immerwahr. So, she was born on the 21st of June in 1870 in a village near Breslau. And you might know Breslau because that was in East Prussia. But at the end of the Second World War, ultimately, when Poland got moved to the west, that became part of Poland. So now, if you go there, it's not called Breslau anymore. But it was famous as well in the Second World War. It was besieged and stuff. It was turned into a fortress city by Hitler. I think it's got a nice sort of castle and stuff. And indeed, one of my four in-laws was a nurse there. As a teenager, she worked as a nurse during the siege of Breslau, and I've had some very interesting discussions about that with her when she was alive. Her name is Inga. Anyway, so that's where she was born, anyway, near Breslau. And she was a very intelligent lady, and she did her PhD, and that was very unusual. In 1900, she graduated. She had to do 4 years. The men were allowed to graduate in 3, and she was the very first woman to do a PhD, but they made her do an extra year. They made her do 4 years. I'm not entirely sure why, just it seems because she was a woman. So she had to do a 4-year PhD, and she was the very first one to graduate from Breslau University, and indeed, she was the first female to obtain a PhD in chemistry in Germany. So she was famous. And interestingly, today, when you do a PhD, you have to have a viva, an oral examination. You have to defend your thesis. And that's done in an office, with a couple of professors that have come in from outside, from another university. But she didn't get the privilege of doing this in a quiet office. She had to defend it, and perhaps they all did back then, I don't know, publicly. So literally in the Great Hall of the university, she had to defend her thesis, and she was examined. And because she was the first female to graduate with or hopefully to graduate with a doctorate, it was quite public. People were interested, and apparently many members of the public flocked in to watch her defend her thesis. So she's quite famous. And I do love the title of her PhD. It was Contributions to the Solubility of Slightly Soluble Salts of Mercury, Cadmium, Copper, Lead, Zinc. So I like that. Try saying that 5 times quickly. Contributions to the Solubility of Slightly Soluble Salts. But anyway, so that's what she did. Anyhow, so in 1901, so she's around 30 at this point when she graduates with the PhD. And then... in the year's August 1901, she married Fritz Haber, who was already famous for developing the Haber process.
What's the Haber process, Master?
Every A-level chemistry student knows the Haber process. It's a way of getting inert nitrogen from the atmosphere to react with methane, and thereby you can produce ammonia, which is a soluble form of nitrogen that can be used as fertilizer. So it's a way of getting, because the atmosphere is 80% nitrogen, but it's useless. And you need, very specialist plants like leguminous vegetables and things can get nitrogen out of the air, but most can't. So you rely on things like lightning storms to get nitrogen into the soil, or certain bacteria that live in the root nodules of these leguminous plants. But with the Haber process, suddenly you're able to make from the air, as it were, a soluble form of nitrogen, so you could fertilise your plants.
I heard it had a more sinister use, Master.
It did as well. If it hadn't been for the Haber process, World War I would have been impossible. Germany could not have fought it, because whereas we had the worldwide empire at the time, we were able to get nitrogenous products, things like, I believe it's called guana, sort of the droppings of various birds and things, and there's tons of this on different islands that we owned around the world and stuff. So we could get fertilizer from other places. Germany couldn't, so they relied on it not just to feed themselves, but primarily to make explosives, because all the sort of the different kinds of explosives, they're all different oxygen and nitrogen compounds. So if you look at their structures, they all have nitrogen and oxygen in them, and there wouldn't have been a way of getting that, doing the chemistry without ammonia. And so really we have Fritz Haber to blame for World War One in one way. Excuse me. Anyhow, that's a digression. So what was Fritz Haber like to live with after she married him? So this is an intelligent, independent woman. And incidentally, I'll stick a picture of her up as a thumbnail. She was extremely beautiful. If you look at the picture, she's a very, very attractive lady. And she seems like a thoroughly nice person from what I've read. And a very good mother. They had one child, Hermann. But what was Fritz like to live with, Fritz Haber, the great chemist? He was ruthlessly self-assertive, and he would basically sort of crush any opposition in his household. He was a real dominant male, and very arrogant and unpleasant by the sound of it. He has an oppressive way of putting himself first. And he would apparently work 18 hours a day, and he would just leave Clara at home with Hermann, their child, and he'd just be off. He'd be off working. Incidentally, they lived directly next to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. It's actually across the lawn, so from her own window she could see the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, where it was one of the labs that was used by Fritz. But it seems he spent most of his time elsewhere, and indeed he'd be, as soon as the war began, he was all across the country, he was going to the front and everything, because he was very keen on pushing gas warfare. Because, well, you ask me.
Yes, Master, why was Fritz Haber so keen on promoting gas warfare?
The reason was Germany had the most highly developed chemical industry in the world, far bigger than the UK or America. And so they could produce vast quantities of all sorts of chemicals, and the Allies could not. They didn't have the infrastructure to do it. And, not wishing to jump ahead, but this is why Germany were introducing so many poisonous gases, and the Allies really couldn't. They couldn't keep up. Not initially, anyway, because they didn't have the infrastructure. It had to be made. So this vast chemical industry in Germany, he knew that this could be a war-winning weapon. If we're being charitable, we could say that he hoped he could bring the war to a quick end with his weapon, and so ultimately fewer people would die. But I don't think that was his reasoning at all from looking at the man. I think he just, I think he liked the thought, he liked the power that he had, that potentially his creations could kill so many people. As every indication, he was extremely proud of himself, and indeed he devoted himself to assiduously research these things. But interestingly, Germany had signed up to the Hague Convention, and so initially in 1914 they didn't really want to breach that. And so when Fritz Haber, it was him, Fritz, that was going to the powers that be in Germany and saying, I can do this, I can make these weapons, and they initially rebuffed him and they said, no, it's illegal. We've signed up to an international treaty, the Hague Convention. We cannot use gas warfare. And so in 1914 they didn't. But then, of course, after it all got deadlocked and stalemated, and really, in all honesty, that it would seem that the thinking generals, those that had a grasp of grand strategy and logistics and economics and so on, after the initial Schlieffen Plan, or whatever you want to call it, that initial invasion of the West had failed in 1914. Had a chance of succeeding, but it didn't. It failed, and after that, really, the war was unwinnable for Germany. It was really unwinnable because they were locked in by hostile powers on every side, and they were being blockaded from the sea by the Royal Navy, and it was only a matter of time. It really was ultimately a blockade that caused Germany to lose. It made the war unwinnable. It was impossible for them to win. Their only chance may have been U-boats sinking convoys to Britain, thereby starving Britain. That was really their only chance of winning. But it was highly unlikely to work because, with scientific countermeasures and so on, if necessary, we would have combated that if the U-boat threat had ever been large enough. And once convoys were introduced, it was, that was never going to work, that strategy. And ultimately, the British merchant marine fleet was just too big. We're talking about so many thousand ships. I forget how many ships flew the British flag, but we're talking ginormous numbers. We're talking many, many thousands. So I'm digressing, but the war was unwinnable after 1914, and people in the high command knew it. And so they were hoping they would grasp at straws, they would break any treaties they'd previously made. And so we come now to 22nd of April 1915, and they've turned to gas warfare. Because they know that this might give us half a chance of actually breaking through on the Western Front. Where do they choose to deploy it? They've done, I believe, a small trial over in the East first. But this is the first big attack with something like 180 tons of chlorine gas, just released from big gas canisters when the wind was favourable. Usually prevailing wind is west to east across Europe, but on this day an easterly wind was blowing towards the west. And they chose to attack at the Ypres salient. And they chose a clever place. They chose to attack on the border between French colonial troops from North Africa, Algerian troops, the border between them and Canadian troops. So it was a place where you could sort of hopefully break the two different armies in half. And the Ypres salient was crucial. It was a little bit of Belgium we were holding on to. And, they could have broken through, taken Ypres, and there was a chance for real strategic results on that day. So what did they do? At 5 o'clock on 22nd of April 1915, they released these, close to 200 tons of chlorine gas, and it blew across. This was the German Fourth Army doing this. It initially caused a few thousand casualties, over 1,000 dead, in fact, of the French Algerian troops, and they ran, and you can't blame them for running. And then, of course, the Canadian troops were hit next, and they also ran, although some of them put up a very stout defence. By no means did they all run. I believe one of the Canadian soldiers won a Victoria Cross for literally manning his machine gun despite suffocating on the gas. And so there were some very brave stands put up by some troops, but the Germans did break through, and they took a couple of villages. I forget which ones now. Langemarck was one, quite a famous name on the Western Front for the Germans. Langemarck, but they didn't have the manpower reserves behind. They didn't have the reserve to really break through, despite making a 4-mile gap in the front, and that is a huge gap. But of course, even had they broken through, which they did, would they have had the logistics? Would they have been able to actually support a large campaign if they'd have had the reserves? Probably not, because once you begin advancing, how do you get supplied? Horses and wagons and so on, until you can get railway lines in there or get lots of trucks and roads. It all takes time. And so it's highly unlikely that it would have been a war-winning breakthrough, but certainly a big gap was torn in the line, many casualties caused, many. I think ultimately, the Second Battle of Ypres, we're talking about 100,000 odd casualties, obviously not all caused by gas, but maybe several tens of thousands were caused by gas. So, getting back to our heroine.
Yeah, you haven't said very much about Clara Helene.
No, it's true. What do I call her heroine? All the time, she was telling her husband, "You're perverting science. Science is for the advancement of mankind. It's for the good of mankind. It's for doing benevolent things. It's not for murder." And she was constantly telling him, and that required a great deal of bravery, because it sounds like he was a very unpleasant man and a very famous man. And he didn't listen to her, of course, but all the time, whenever she could, she was telling him, "No, what you're doing is wrong." And of course, this was enhanced by a little earlier, over there, just literally across the lawn, out of her window, she saw a massive explosion, and so she ran out and ran into the lab. She still had access to the lab, even though her husband had sort of stopped her doing proper research. She was still dabbling a little in the lab. But anyway, there's this massive explosion. So she ran over there and went in there, and her good friend Otto Sacker had been killed by an explosion, and he was working on her husband's project. He was experimenting with another poisonous gas that was also highly explosive, and she ran in there and loosened his collar. He was lying on the ground, but ultimately he died from that explosion, and she was literally there as it happened, trying to save his life, but he died. And so after that happened, she was even more dead against chemical warfare. And then we have the attack on Ypres on the 22nd of April 1915. Fritz Haber comes home, and Clara has a tremendous argument with him, absolutely tremendous, telling him how evil he is and how he's gone against, all the principles of philosophy, against humanity. And she's so furious with him, and he won't listen. And then ultimately, on the 2nd of May, 1915, apparently, this is where he gets a bit of controversy. She got hold of his service revolver, and apparently she fired 2 shots. She fired 1 shot in the air, and then the second shot into her heart, and she died. Now, I've often wondered, it was very hushed up at the time, the fact that she took her own life at that point, because she just, in that time, she couldn't divorce him, and I guess she saw no way out, and she couldn't change him. I mean, the only better thing to have done might have been to have shot him with the first bullet and then herself. But, unfortunately, yeah. But here's the thing. It was hushed up at the time. So in the local newspaper, nothing was reported. And indeed, about a week later, there was just a very, very small article saying the wife of Dr. Haber, this unhappy lady, has shot herself, and we don't know why. Kind of thing. It was very disrespectful, and it was extremely small. And I've often wondered, could it have been that Fritz Haber actually murdered her? I'm not sure that there's any evidence that she did shoot herself, because there was no autopsy conducted. What we do know is the day afterwards, he didn't care. He just flew off to the Eastern Front to oversee another gas attack. So his wife, Clara, killed herself, and then the next day he vanishes. Now, if that happened today, there certainly would have been an investigation, wouldn't there? Because how do we really know that she shot herself? How do we know that it wasn't him that shot her? But anyway, yeah, so that's the end of the video. Just a tribute to Clara Helene Immerwahr, who was a brilliant chemist, and who, more than anything, was a moral person. And she did everything she could to resist her husband's efforts to kill and maim with gas. But ultimately, she failed in that, and she took her own life.